Hey guys, it's Dani. Alrighty, today we're gonna perform a repotting. And well, this is a little bit of a different repotting because I have a Cattleya here, which is kind of pot bound, and also she is potted in sphagnum moss. I told you in my previous videos that I actually do enjoy working with sphagnum moss. It's much easier than bark for me, of course depends on the orchid. So today I'm going to show you how I go about removing the sphagnum moss from the roots of this orchid, and it's going to be a good example because I have quite a few roots here, and show you how I make my life a little bit easier with repotting these types of orchids. Now, before we move on, let's answer the question if I repot every new orchid that I purchase. And the answer is yes, I do have my preferred growing setups. You might know they're semi-hydroponics for the vast majority of my orchids. And this is a Cattleya which will do fantastic in semi-hydroponics for me. So obviously I do need to change the setup. I also don't know anything about this medium, how old it is, if it is breaking down, if it harbors pests and things of the sort. So yes, every new orchid gets repotted no matter what. When do I repot it though? Well, that varies a little bit. I need to take a look at the orchid. Of course that if we make bad repottings, orchids stale or they get set back. And by bad repottings, I'm referring to damaging root systems. Sometimes it is inevitable to damage roots, especially with bark. Reason why I'm not a fan of bark, but I do enjoy sphagnum moss. And in the orchid hobby, there is such a thing as the right time to repot an orchid. Basically, it refers to the moment new roots are growing, because it is inevitable you will damage some roots, at least have new ones growing and being capable of absorbing water and nutrients as soon as possible so the staling is minimized. That is the whole logic behind repotting orchids at the right time. However, sometimes we cannot wait for the right time. Let's say we have snails, mealybugs, we have a very acidic broken down medium, or the orchid roots are suffocated. We need to repot right now and we need to damage the roots. Well, we should actually repot then and there if the orchid really needs it, because even if we still the orchid, it's already stressed and damaged probably by the medium, so why not give it a fresh new life right away? But if the orchid is looking okay and I don't see signs of pests or anything bad happening with the medium, I can wait for the orchid to actively grow root tips. And that's pretty much the secret, seeing how the root system is, and if it is actively growing, if I see root tips, then for me, that is a good time to repot. I don't necessarily need to see root tips coming from the new growth. In my case, you can see new growth is really tiny. It probably will take a while until it starts to produce roots, but I can see that the orchid is active at the moment. I do have a lot of roots, and for me, removing sphagnum moss is really a piece of cake. I don't think I will damage too many roots. So in this case, I will repot this orchid right now. And this one I just received it, I just purchased it. It is a Potinara Burana Beauty. It has been on my wish list for ages because Brad has it, for those of you who know my channel. So because the orchid is actively growing roots, also I'm dealing with sphagnum moss and not bark, which means I will not damage these roots way too much. Also, sphagnum moss tends to stay moist, and semi-hydroponics is a moist environment. The so-called transplant shock for this orchid will be minimal. I choose to repot it right now, even though I received it 2 days ago. But there are orchids which I'd rather wait with, and typically they are the ones who have a very specific growth pattern. For example, the Dendrobium nestor. It is a hybrid of 2 deciduous dendrobiums. With that one, if I repot it at the wrong time, when roots are not actively being produced, then I stale the orchid so badly that I think it will recover in 2 years. That orchid has a specific annual growth. Many Cattleyas don't have annual growth as such. They have pretty much continuous growth. So recovery of a Cattleya can be faster than recovery of a deciduous dendrobium. Reason why with that dendrobium I'm waiting for new roots to start growing. I purchased one last week. I don't intend to repot it because I know its growth pattern. So as you can see, there are orchids that I really don't repot the moment I get them. And you might have noticed that I didn't mention anything about flowers. I don't typically care about flowers. I can always rebloom these orchids. I care most about the health of the orchid. If the orchid is healthy, growing vigorously, it will eventually bloom. So first step is to wet the sphagnum moss. It is almost impossible to work with dry sphagnum moss when removing it from the root system. It simply doesn't want to come off the roots. So you absolutely need to completely drench the moss. A little side note, as you can see, the roots of my Cattleya orchid are green, and that's because they're wet. I already soaked this pot, but not all Cattleyas will have green roots. This isn't a transparent pot. The roots received light, therefore they contain chlorophyll, but if it were to be a black or opaque pot through which light cannot enter, the roots would have been white and they wouldn't have a green up when I watered them. That's because chlorophyll would not be present. Also, sometimes the roots can have algae formed on them and they can be green even if dry. So it's not necessarily a rule that the orchid roots will green up. With experience, you will notice if they have algae or anything. If you're not sure if your pot is wet or not, soak it, wet it. It doesn't really matter. We're gonna get the orchid out of this pot anyway. Alrighty, so this is actually one of those very flimsy pots. There are two ways of going about this. One, trying to pull the orchid out, and two, actually cutting the pot. We will not be reusing this pot. First, just because I'm lazy, I want to see if the orchid wants to come out of the pot. And it did. There we go. You can see the pot is just not usable anymore. And here's the orchid. She's pot bound. So now we can start to remove the sphagnum moss. So the first thing that I will try to do is to remove the moss with my fingers. And there are places where I don't really have a lot of roots. In these places, I can actually work out the moss with my fingers. And as a general idea, the middle is almost never full of roots. It's the sides that contain a lot of roots and you need to be careful with. But right here in the center, generally, not all the time, you will not have too many roots. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove the moss as much as I can with my fingers here. Okay, so I took out as much moss as I could with my fingers, but at this point, I'm not comfortable with the roots anymore. I would have to damage all of these root tips that I managed not to damage until now. So now it's time to work with the tweezers. My favorite way to remove sphagnum moss is with the use of this, let's say, narrow nose tweezers. I'm not sure how to call these. The prongs, let's say, I prefer them to be pointy and narrow because I can go in between the roots and grab the sphagnum moss without actually damaging the roots. The normal tweezers, the one that you usually use on your eyebrows, it doesn't really do a good job. I personally cannot really work with it. I prefer something like this. So with the tweezers, I can actually grab pieces of sphagnum moss and pull them out where my fingers actually would damage the root system. So now I'm going to go ahead and grab onto sphagnum moss pieces and just pull them out between the roots with the prongs, practically with my tweezers pressed. I can go in between the roots and make the sphagnum moss come off the roots or make it slide downward without, again, damaging the root system because the tip is not very sharp. It's just pointy. So I'm gonna go ahead and remove the sphagnum moss carefully like that. I forgot to tell you, this takes time. It's not a fast way to remove sphagnum moss, but it is very, very safe. And I prefer to take my time and make sure that the root system is okay, then rush and destroy everything and have a setback orchid. So beware. Midway through, you can actually go to the sink and rinse the root system again. This will make pieces of the moss fall into the sink and also the moss will become more visible. And it will help you see exactly what you still have to remove. So I have completely removed the sphagnum moss from the roots of my orchid and I can go ahead and repot it now. A little side note, if you remove moss but then you plan to repot the orchid into fresh moss, there's really no need to remove all the bits and pieces of sphagnum moss attached to the roots. You can leave a few pieces if it means not damaging some roots. Just try your best to remove as much as possible. However, If you plan to completely change the medium, I would suggest you remove as much as humanly possible. For example, I plan to pot this orchid in completely inorganic medium. Leaving organic medium behind will be very damaging to my setup, so as much as I could, I removed everything. I'm pretty sure it's not 100% removed, but I do believe it's in the 90s, maybe 98% remove, which is good. So what I'm gonna do now is throw away this medium. I'm going to sterilize my working tray with some alcohol, and then I will spray the roots of my orchid with hydrogen peroxide 3% because I already saw a snail bite, and hydrogen peroxide gets you rid of snails and even their eggs. By the way, this orchid didn't really have too many dead roots. Whatever roots were not looking all that great, I kind of just pulled them away and they came right off. But this orchid has a really good root system. No point in actually going in and removing anything, at least for now. So I'm going to be using my customized semi-hydroponic pot as usual, and this will just go like any other semi-hydro repotting. So my orchid is now repotted, but pretty much this is how I would go about orchids that I would repot in a different medium. I don't have many orchids in organic medium at the moment. My preferred medium is semi-hydroponics, and if you don't know much about it, check the description down below. I will add more info. And as a little side note, this is a bit tiny, this pot. I would have gone for a bigger one. I just don't have one at the moment I need to purchase. But it's okay because this orchid had a lot of roots. Cattleyas tend to lose all their roots when you repot them. Even if we were as gentle as possible with the root system, there is a chance some of them did get damaged. No matter what and how careful you are, you will actually damage a few roots, one or two perhaps, that will die off. So I will need to re-repot this orchid probably within a year or so, but that's okay because semi-hydroponics and inorganic medium means very gentle repottings. You don't even need to remove any medium. And I will add down below a video in which I show you how I, let's say, up-pot orchids from a tinier pot to a bigger pot. And I think that is a wrap. I also watered this orchid to make sure I have water in my reservoir. I'm going to place it in a high light location since it's a Cattleya, and job well done. I think it took me 15-20 minutes to remove all of that moss, and I would say this is a medium difficulty job. Phalaenopsis are usually a few minutes work because they have very thick roots, especially the mini Phalaenopsis, where you don't have a lot of moss to remove. But you can also have harder situations than this. Let's think about oncidiums and fine-rooted orchids. I would try to remove the moss only with the tweezers. So this Cattleya would be somewhere in the middle between those two situations. Alrighty guys, I hope you found this useful. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope you'll have an amazing Sunday. And you know the drill, if you've enjoyed this video, give it a thumbs up. If you hated it, give it a thumbs down. Subscribe to my channel for daily orchid videos, and don't forget to turn on notifications in case you want to see my videos among the first. And with that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye!